In the spring of 1945, as the Third Army swept through Germany at a pace that left the German High Command struggling to react, Patton's forces encountered something that changed the nature of the advance in a way that no amount of battlefield experience had fully prepared them for. It was not a new weapon. It was not a new defensive tactic. It was something older and simpler, and in many ways more disturbing than either of those things. It was a city that had been turned into a trap. The German army by the spring of 1945 had largely lost the ability to fight in the open. The formations that could have contested the Third Army's advance in a conventional engagement had been destroyed or captured or pushed back to defensive lines further east. What remained in many of the German cities and towns that Patton's forces were moving through was a mixture of SS units that had orders to defend to the last man. Volkssturm militia made up of old men and boys who had been handed weapons and told to fight, and in some cases, regular Wehrmacht officers who were trying to do their duty to a regime that had clearly already lost, while simultaneously trying to preserve enough of their honor to live with themselves afterward. The city of Kronberg sat at a strategic crossroads in central Germany that made it important to Patton's advance in ways that went beyond its size or its symbolic significance. The roads that ran through Kronberg connected to a network of routes that Patton needed for his next phase of operations. Taking Kronberg quickly meant maintaining the momentum that was the Third Army's defining characteristic. Losing time at Kronberg meant giving the Germans further east more hours to organize resistance that would cost more American lives to break through. The German commander responsible for Kronberg was a colonel named Werner Alderman. He was a career officer, a man who had served in the Wehrmacht since before the war, who had fought in Poland and France and on the Eastern Front, and who had accumulated the kind of combat record that the German military rewarded with decorations and promotions, and the kind of professional respect that was the only currency that still had value in an army that was losing everything else. He was not a fanatic. He was not an ideologue. He was a soldier who had been given an order and who intended to carry it out, because carrying out orders was what soldiers did, and because he had spent 30 years building an identity around that fact. The order he had been given was to hold Kronberg. Hold it at any cost. Deny it to the Americans for as long as humanly possible. And Alderman, looking at the forces available to him and the forces coming toward him, had made a calculation that a conventional defense was impossible. He did not have the men or the equipment to stop the Third Army in open battle. What he had was time, and engineers, and a city full of buildings that could be turned from shelter into weapons. What Alderman's engineers did to Kronberg in the days before Patton's forces arrived was methodical and thorough, and deeply professional in the specific way that German military engineering was always professional, which was to say, it was done with precision and attention to detail and complete disregard for the consequences to the civilians who still lived in the city. They mined the main roads. They mined the bridges. They mined the buildings that American soldiers would most likely use for cover during an urban assault. They mined the town hall and the hospital and the church and the school. They wired explosives to doors and windows and staircases and cellar entrances. They turned the entire urban landscape of Kronberg into a killing ground that was designed to destroy any force that tried to move through it in the normal way that forces moved through cities. And then they evacuated the German military personnel to defensive positions on the eastern edge of the city and waited. Patton's advance units reached the outskirts of Kronberg on a Tuesday morning in late March. The initial reconnaissance reported something unusual. The city appeared quiet. There was no visible German defensive presence on the approaches, no artillery fire, no sniper activity, none of the resistance that Patton's men had learned to expect when they approached a defended position. The streets were empty. The buildings appeared intact. It looked, from the outside, like a city that had decided not to fight. The officer commanding the lead elements sent back a report that something was wrong. He could not specify what was wrong, but the absence of resistance in a city that was supposed to be defended felt wrong in the specific way that things feel wrong to soldiers who have survived long enough to develop instincts about these things. He requested permission to halt and conduct a more thorough reconnaissance before advancing into the urban area. The permission was granted, and the reconnaissance found the mines. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough of them to make the picture clear. The city had been prepared as a trap on a scale that none of Patton's engineers had encountered before in this campaign. The estimate that came back to Third Army headquarters was that clearing Kronberg safely would take days, possibly a week, and would require engineering resources that would slow the entire advance, while those resources were concentrated on a single city. Patton read the report at his headquarters and was silent for a longer moment than his staff was used to seeing from him. Then he asked for the best available intelligence on the German commander responsible for Kronberg. The name Alderman came back with a service record attached. Patton read the service record. Then he dictated a message. The message was addressed to Colonel Werner Alderman, commanding German forces in and around Kronberg. It was delivered through a combination of captured German radio frequencies and a local civilian intermediary who was found willing to carry a written copy into the German lines. Patton's staff was uncertain this would work. Patton told them to send it anyway. The message said the following. It said that General Patton was aware of the preparations that had been made in Kronberg and that he understood the military logic behind them. It said that he had a professional respect for thorough preparation, and that he acknowledged the engineering work that had been done as competent. It said that none of this would matter in the outcome, because the Third Army was going to take Kronberg regardless of how it had been prepared, and that the only question was what Kronberg looked like when that happened. Then the message said something that nobody on Patton's staff had heard him say before in quite this form. It said that if Alderman's forces withdrew from Kronberg and provided accurate maps of all mined locations within the city, Patton would ensure that Alderman and his men were treated as prisoners of war in full accordance with the Geneva Convention, and that Alderman's cooperation would be recorded in the official Third Army report in terms that accurately reflected what he had done. But if Alderman chose to maintain the defense and American soldiers died on mines in Kronberg streets, Patton said that he would personally ensure that every resource available to the Third Army was brought to bear on the German positions east of the city without the restraint that he would otherwise apply to an enemy that was behaving within the accepted boundaries of warfare. He said that the men who died on those mines would be on Alderman's account, and that he intended to collect that account in full. Then the message said one more thing. It said that Patton had read Alderman's service record, and that it was the service record of a professional soldier who had fought with honor in difficult circumstances over many years. It said that professional soldiers who had served with honor deserved to end their service with honor, and that the choice Alderman made in the next 12 hours would determine whether that was possible. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary communication from a commanding general to an enemy officer. Patton's staff debated afterward whether it was a threat, an offer, or something in between. The honest answer was that it was all three simultaneously, which was characteristic of the way Patton operated when he was at his most effective. He had given Alderman a reason to comply, a warning about the consequences of not complying, and an appeal to the professional identity that the German officer had spent his life constructing. He had done all of this in a message that took less than 2 pages to deliver, and that had been composed in less than 20 minutes. Alderman received the message at his forward command post east of Kronberg. He read it twice. Then he called his senior officers together and told them what it said. The discussion that followed lasted 3 hours, which was longer than Patton had given him, but shorter than the conversation might have been in different circumstances. The officers who had spent years fighting in the Wehrmacht, who had watched the army they served, transformed into an instrument of a regime that had destroyed everything they had believed they were fighting to protect, who had arrived at this moment in a German city in the spring of 1945, with nothing left to defend except the professional identity that Patton's message had specifically addressed. Those officers were not unanimous, but they were a majority. Alderman sent a response. It said that he was prepared to discuss terms. It used the language of military formality that German officers used when they were doing something that required the cover of procedure, but the meaning was clear. He was going to comply. The maps arrived at Third Army headquarters the following morning. They were detailed, accurate, and comprehensive in a way that Patton's engineers said they had not expected. Every mined location in Kronberg was marked. Every wired explosive was identified. The maps had been prepared with the same professional thoroughness that had characterized the preparation of the trap in the first place, which meant they were reliable in a way that saved American lives that would otherwise have been lost. Patton's engineers moved through Kronberg with the maps and cleared it in 36 hours instead of the week that had been estimated. The advance continued. Kronberg was taken without a single American casualty from mines, which was something that would not have been true if Alderman had chosen differently. Alderman and his men were processed as prisoners of war, as Patton had promised. His cooperation was noted in the official Third Army report, as Patton had promised. Whether this helped him in the post-war proceedings that followed is not clearly documented. What is documented is that when Patton was told that Kronberg had been cleared and the advance could continue, he said only that it was the right outcome, and that Alderman had made the right choice, and that he hoped the German officer understood that the choice he had made was the honorable one rather than the easy one, because those were not always the same thing, and in this case, they happened to be. His staff asked him afterward what he would have done if Alderman had not responded. What would have happened to Kronberg if the German commander had chosen to maintain the defense and force Patton to fight through a mined city street by street? Patton looked at the officer who asked this question for a moment. Then he said that he would have done exactly what he had threatened to do. He would have brought everything available to bear on the German positions, and he would not have moderated that response in any way. He said that threats that were not backed by intention were not threats. They were requests, and he had never in his life made a request when he intended a threat. Then he said that he had genuinely hoped Alderman would respond the way he did, not because it made the military situation easier, though it did, but because the alternative would have required him to destroy the professional record of a soldier who had, by the evidence available, served with genuine honor in a dishonorable cause. He said that there were not many of those left in the German army by the spring of 1945, and that he saw no reason to waste them unnecessarily. It was, his staff agreed afterward, the most Patton thing he had said in a very long time. The threat had been real. The respect had been real. The outcome had been the result of both of those things being communicated clearly to a man who was capable of understanding them. And George Patton had known from the beginning that Alderman was that kind of man, because he had read his service record and recognized in it the outline of someone who, in different circumstances, might have been exactly the kind of soldier Patton most respected. The war ended 6 weeks later. Patton never met Alderman in person. The two men who had conducted one of the strangest negotiations of the entire Western campaign never sat in the same room or shook hands or had the conversation that the exchange of messages had gestured toward. They communicated through intermediaries, through radio frequencies, through a civilian carrying a written message through the lines, and through the professional language of soldiers who understood each other well enough to reach an agreement without ever meeting face to face. That was enough. In the spring of 1945, in a war that was ending but had not yet ended, with men still dying every day for ground that would be irrelevant in 6 weeks, it was more than enough.